Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The Ultimate Guide to Container Security, Tips and Tricks for Success. This event is presented in partnership thanks to our friends over at Palo Alto Networks. Now, before we get started, there's just a few things that you should know about the webinar. My name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as the host. As always, we want these events to be educational, and we encourage your questions. They're in the questions pane of the audience console. We'll be doing a Q&A session at the end of the event, so keep those questions coming. We know containers and container security, it's a hot topic, and many of you out there, like me, are still learning, and we have a lot left to learn. So keep those questions coming. Again, I know you're going to have a lot of questions. We also have a number of resources there in the handouts tab. I want to call your attention to those. Make sure that you check those out. At the end of the webinar, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $250 gift card prize. If you're watching this on demand, of course, the drawing has already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found right there in the handouts tab. And then today, we also have our best question prize for an additional $50 Amazon gift card. That means you have to ask a question to be entered into the prize drawing. So make it a good question, ask your questions, and you'll be entered into that drawing. Of course, you must still meet the prize terms and conditions. All right, and with that, it's now my pleasure to introduce today's expert presenters. I'm excited to bring in Gareth Baruch, Global Solutions Architect for Prisma Cloud at Palo Alto Networks, and David Dukenfield, Global Solutions Architect for 5G, 4G Mobility Security at Palo Alto Networks. Gareth and David, it's great to have you on the event. I'll first hand it off to you, David. Take it away.
Hi, I'm Dave Dukenfield, Global Solutions Architect over at Palo Alto. Today, we're taking a little bit about container security. Part of it's a little fundamental front end, and then Gareth Baruch will bring in what we're doing there with Prisma Cloud as a security tool from the full life cycle of a container. So here's the agenda for today. We've got the basics I'll be covering, and then Gareth will come in and do both security of that containerized environment and some of the things we're doing with Prisma Cloud. So basic container architecture. So again, we'll cover containerization in detail, but the classic things you've heard before, and you can see some of these classic icons there. I'll talk to them in a second, but reducing overhead, so getting more use out of your environment, portability across different environments, consistent operation across those different environments, being able to scale up, scale down, and be able to make sure you have high available services, better application development. This was built in cloud native principles, so you're going to see taking advantage of the agile lifecycle. And I'll recommend some basic best practices for security, but Gareth will take the lion's share there. The two big ones here are, you see on the top, Docker, which is, to me, in my cooking analogies, is the frying pan you'll be cooking your container in, and Kubernetes is more the kitchen where you have all these resources you need to support the Docker environment. So if you see here, this comparison between what we grew up in the virtual world, the VM world, versus on the left side, the containers. If you look in the VM world, you'll see every one of those VMs, all those apps, app A, B, and C, are running on their own guest OS. So to spin that up takes minutes just to get there. And then in the world of containers, minutes is a lifetime. And we treat each one as if it needs to be repaired, addressed, as opposed to a container where we just say, fine, it failed, bring up another one. On the left, you can see the different applications. We're calling them microservices because they're very specific in what they're trying to do. They're following the cloud native principles. They run on top of the Docker engine, which runs on top of a VM or an OS. And again, I'll speak to that as well. So here are the classics that you're going to see, but this is a good reason to go down the container path. Again, without an OS per your application or your microservice, better resource using. You've got increased portability. We package these up in container files. I'll talk to that in a minute, but those container files will run on any OS. That being said, if it's a Windows app, it should run on a Windows OS. And if it's a Linux-based one, which most are, it runs on a Linux OS, but it doesn't care which Linux OS. Consistent operation. So you're packaging up to run the same, whether it be Core OS or any other OS that you can think of that's it'll be running on top of. Scalability and efficiency, so it's made so that it's being observed, and when things go down, they come up quickly. If it needs to spin up another or another 10, it does that. So it's built, again, like I said, cloud native principles. The application development where you can test quickly and roll these up in containers exists. And lastly, how we do container security from both some best practices as well as what we do with Prisma Cloud Compute. So 3 top use cases: lift and shift. So imagine you have a VM running an application, trying to bring that down into a containerized form, package it up and get it to run. We won't know enough about scalability and other parts that I'll speak to, but at least we'll run as a container. The next one's refactoring, so that this existing use case can then take advantage of some of the Kubernetes, and I'll get to that in a minute, functionality, so it can spin up, spin down, and be more container-like. And lastly, taking your requirements and build it from the ground up as a true container application. I'm focusing only on Linux here as an example, but again, you can have container optimized OS. So you're not bringing in everything. If you've ever loaded an Ubuntu desktop, you realize you get tons of tools, from Office clones to MP3 players. This one is focused. You can see the list here on the right on OSs that were developed for containers. So you can see that all the usual suspects here: Red Hat, VMware, Rancher. You've got Chrome has their own, AWS, Google has their own, Azure. And yes, you can use the normal Linux distributions, but keep in mind they'll be chock full of other things as well. I would stay with the server side. So what is a container? Well, container is an image. You'll hear container image all the time. It sits in a repository where you collect these, and they should be signed and blessed and been reviewed, and Prisma Cloud allows you to do that. But in that are the executables, the binaries, the libraries, JSON with all the labels, enough so that it knows how to run, whether you stuck it on Rancher or CoreOS or in a public cloud. Once it gets initiated and opened up and run, that's where the engine does it. It unpacks that and looks through the metadata and figures out how to run it, what the networking should be, various elements of it. So these are the 2 building blocks that are in Linux. They've always been there. They're key in doing the equivalent of what you see when you see a hypervisor one, and as an example of VMware. So instead of VMware being how you keep these various applications separate from each other, again, at the quote Ghostbusters, we're not crossing the streams here. The 2 key are namespace and control group, but most people call it C group, and they're fundamental. So namespace basically lets you create your own processes, and I'll get to it in a second, and your own IDs. And then the control group lets you take advantage of what's in hardware and give you your own piece of it. So namespaces, isolates your processes from the other process running in the OS. It looks to it as if it's its own OS. It's isolated, and it gives its own dedicated resource on top of that. So as you can see, the file system, network stack, process IDs, user IDs, everything you're used to seeing in Linux, but it'll be, if you're in that namespace and you do a PSOX, you're only going to see your process IDs. You're not going to see the one next to it or the one next to that. It's abstracted. There are some good rules about just best practices to make sure the 2 don't, see each other. But generally speaking, this user space separates them from a process. And C groups or control groups are a way to then take and isolate the various pieces of resources, CPU, memory, disk, network, and give it to just that namespace. So we got one that basically isolates the software namespace, and then one that isolates the hardware, C group. So these are the 2 keys. And whoever thought of it, brilliant person, to go like, I don't need a hypervisor and an OS to do that. Let the OS do it. So basic container types you're going to see. These are the 3 that I think of. The one that you're going to most popular is the application. I'm building some microservice, whether it be a web server, whether it be a database backend. I come from a mobility 5G world. Just a fact that 5G is entirely container-based. So when you get that 5G phone or 5G IoT or 5G router, it is running totally over container, including the radio, including all the elements of the core. The next one is sometimes you need your own operating system. So yes, you can create a container that has its own total operating system. Maybe you're doing this because of a unique requirement or separation. This, can often land in places like air-gapped networks or other places where you need separation. The last one is a container that is super privileged. Now, normally recommended you have the least privileges on a container so that people can't come in and compromise them and do some lateral movement. But there are times when you want to have a super privileged container as a development tool to be able to do things like look at a kernel, to tap in for analysis and debug. And so that's an option too. So going top bottom, just an application running on an OS, self-contained with an OS, and then just pretty much you own the world. So going back, the image we spoke of before, this is the binaries, the libraries, the metadata. The registry is where we keep them all. They're both public and private. So if you get used to places like GitHub and things, you can see some of the private. Working with vendors, they may actually their own public repositories, and you bring it into your own Prisma Cloud, and Gareth will talk to it. Prisma Cloud Compute, we'll talk to what we do with registries. And lastly, the runtime. There are a lot of different runtimes that run these containers. Docker, the one I mentioned, Containerd, Cryo. They're all there, but generally speaking, Docker seems to be the prevalent one at the moment. So just a simple architecture, and I'll speak to each one in a bit. You've got your user interface and kubectl. You'll have a lot of people go, well, kubectl, kubecontrol, kubectl. So one's the user interface, a graphic, one's the CLI. You break a master node that controls all your architecture. This is how Kubernetes run. And then you have worker nodes. Think of a node, I'll speak to in a second. Node is either a hardware computer or a virtualized space. It's the one that gives you your resources, your CPU, your memory, your network access. And so this is a basic architecture. You can actually, I have links later, you can spin up your own called Minikube that puts these two nodes together for simplicity. But essentially the idea is that the master node is building, watching, and letting you interact with the API server across these various nodes. And in those nodes, you're going to run these containers. This one's just a chatty one, but you can see, again, master on top, the worker nodes on the bottom. There's constant conversation going on. You can see the key one here, and I'll talk to you in a second, is the API server. That's the communication point between the master and the nodes. It's talking, you can see that pinkish arrow from the API. It's talking to the kubelet. That is the onboard worker node communication function. So you can see all the various things going on here, including networking. So I'm not going to cover it here, but this is just what you'll see as an overall. I'll speak to each of the members of the master in a minute. I showed you there's an API. I'll get to that in a second, but this is the CLI. Through the API, you're able to do everything you want to do there, including creation, inspection, anything you want. So there's a full kubectl command language that you can take advantage of. And you could obviously script it as well. Instead of scripting, go to the next page. You can create YAML files. So, yet another markup language where you actually create the actual pods that you're going to create. So in this one, there are different kinds of pods I'll talk to in a second. This one's just a deployment. It's running Nginx. It's running 3 of them. So you can actually have, load balance between the two. And you can see down there, the actual container is, the actual image name is called Hello World, the latest one, living on port 80. So this could be then run and using the kubectl commands and launch a 3 replica Nginx running your Hello World one. So this is a very simple example, but everything has, between the metadata here, the kind, the API version, everything's unique to what you're trying to roll out. 3 flavors I always say. The middle one we just talked about, it's a deployment. Replica set, meaning there's more than one, could be one, but you can build as big as you want, horizontally scaling. On the left is a daemon set. I always look at daemon set as sitting in a single, I'll talk what a pod is in a second, sitting in a pod. It could be monitoring, it could be a network interface. We have firewalls that are actual containers that will sit as a daemon set in a cluster. I'll speak to that in a second, to allow traffic coming into your pod to go through a firewall or regress through a firewall. And lastly, on the right is stateful set, which basically says, well, if you think about from the replica set, it's stateless, especially if you're going through a web server, you can come back again, doesn't care. If you're doing something that's stateful, you want to have multiple ways of giving you high availability so they share volume so they can actually share state. So here's an abstraction from the bottom up. There's the container sitting on the container runtime. It's got both a kubelet to talk to it, a kube proxy to allow who comes into it. It's sitting on a node, which sits on top of that is the pod, which is sitting on the replica set, which is the deployment you issued. A node, as I mentioned, is just the working environment, whether it's a physical hardware, whether it's virtualized to give you, again, CPU, memory, all the resources you need to run this this container. So a cluster is a collection of nodes. So you could have multiple nodes, and each one, again, you can see bare metal or virtualized. Each one of those nodes is running these containers, and those are called pods. And I'll show that on the next one as well. So a pod to me is the smallest unit of a containerized service. And I'll make it really simple. It could be a web server front-ended with a database in the back end. That would consider to be a pod. You could have multiple pods. You can load balance across pods. You could have high availability. So you've got the master the master node running these worker nodes. And in those nodes, you can see on the right there are various Docker containers running. So orchestration. Kubernetes allows you to automate all of this, to spin it up, to watch it, to be able to monitor it, log it, whatever. These are some of the various options out there. Kubernetes itself is out there. Rancher has its own distribution. You can see it all across all the public cloud here. Amazon, Azure, and Google, they have their own version of a Kubernetes orchestration to spin up your services in their cloud. Red has its own platform, so OpenShift, and they keep going. Mirantis, Apache, Docker has its own. So everybody has their way, because at the end of the day, you're not just going on a box, and you could just hand load Docker. You can load Docker by itself. You can load Nginx on top of Docker. But if you're building a large enough service, you want to be able to orchestrate it and monitor it and watch it. So here are the elements you see in the master node. Starting in the upper left, you've got this API service. That's a front end, whether you're talking with kubectl or you actually have a dashboard as well. Going around etcd, it's the key store that keeps state of everything that's running. And so if you were to back up your system, you'd be backing up etcd, but it's in real time. Coming around again. Kubelet sits, it's an agent that runs on each of the worker nodes that allows the API to communicate to it. Coming back around again, there's the container. When we talked about that, there's the Docker, the Rocket, they can actually run your container. Coming back around, the controller. So the controller is the brain here. It's the one that's watching to see what's up, what's down, what needs to spin up, what needs to spin down. So it's trying to match what's in etcd, what's it told. And lastly, scheduler, which is, end of the day, I've got a bunch of resources, a bunch of nodes. I spin up something new, maybe another replica, maybe a whole new service. I go to the scheduler, say, all right, what's available? Please put this in the right place. And you'll see things like, not only looking for right resources and CPU and memory, you're looking for what's called affinity and anti-affinity. Because if you have services that you want to be highly available, if you put all the databases on one, say, physical server, and that server goes belly up, you've lost everything. So schedule is smart enough with the right rules to go, I need to separate certain of these microservices on different, whether it be virtual or bare metal, so that you have a higher level of probability of having high availability. So just to bring it all together, this is what a working Kubernetes construct looks like, where you've got an ingress IP address that's being mapped to services that, being done by the Kubernetes setup. You're reaching out then from those services to go out to the right pod. So those pods, that service may be fixed as an IP address, and you spin up all the pods, and it does that kube proxy will figure out how to then load balance across those. And you can see you can have multiple worker nodes having multiple functions, so that high availability is there, while the master node in the upper right is, again, watching it for health with the controller, figuring out where to go with the schedule, using the API server to do this communication. This is the nice slide. This is the ecosystem. You think about building this huge container scenario. And again, my world, it could be an entire, nationwide 5G service. It could be someone just hosting, think of something big like an Etsy or an Amazon running this, they're all containerized, right? And you can see the necessary tools you need in this ecosystem, not just that runtime in the third row there, but how to provision it, how to orchestrate it with Kubernetes. And then on to the right there, you're going to see monitoring, logging, tracing, and how you want to host that across the different platform. This is the nice slide. Since this is a huge opportunity, this is rather new. This is from the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNCF. You don't have to zoom in here. Those are the same rows and boxes of the previous slide, but now those are the vendors who actually are speaking to it. So you have a lot of choices here when it comes to who am I using for monitoring tool? Who am I using as a possible platform? Could you go across the board here? So you have a lot of choices here, and it's up to obviously the diligent student to figure out the best of their world. So just some best practices you want to do here. Obviously for namespaces, again, zero trust, strong authentication, authorization, access, least privilege across it. Make sure that your images have been scanned and are reliable and hopefully signed so that there's no one breaking in and doing any lateral movement. Make sure your Kubernetes namespace has resource quotas. So you don't want something to be given unlimited memory, unlimited, CPU. And last, network policies. Like you're building a system. Certainly A should be able, you define that A can talk to B and B can talk to C, but A can't talk to C. So define what your network policies are, who can talk to each other in that total wrap-up picture before. So I think that's pretty much the whole picture of it. I've got a few additional sites here that'll come with it, but there's good documentation from Kubernetes, obviously the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. There's a couple of good sources out there on YouTube you can go to. They're really good, especially that 23 video if you have the time. They also include, I believe, in the absolute beginner one is also how to spin up Minikube on your laptop so you can get a more fun lab of your own. So I think that's it for me, and I'm going to be passing this over to Gareth.
Hey guys. Well, just a brief introduction. I'm Gareth Baruch. I'm the Global Solutions Architect for Prisma Cloud, based out of Dubai, and I'll be helping you guys to understand a little bit more about security for containerized environments. Just to go into more of what Dave Dukenfield covered, we'll look at how do we actually secure the container landscape that we have now implemented in your environments. So some of the things that we're going to address, obviously, will be attack surface, the network, host, orchestration, and container security aspects of your environment. One of the first things we need to understand is obviously the attack surface of a container environment. As you can see from the diagram here, there is a number of components, as Dave Dukenfield already alluded to in the previous presentation or section of the presentation. There's multiple components. So each of these have their own security risks that we need to address. So things like obviously networking, these can be scaled both from the host perspective as well as the container environment itself. These are critical things that we need to look at, and how do we do network separation and hardening for those. We look at the host itself. So there's two host components potentially, one for the container itself and one for the host that's hosting Docker and the images that are going to be deployed for your container. In these cases, we need to look at how they are configured, potential vulnerabilities, and for the applications that are native to container themselves, where you built one application, could be Nginx or something like that, we look at the vulnerabilities for those applications themselves. Additionally, we obviously have the orchestration component, which is obviously the Kubernetes infrastructure that Dave was alluding to as well previously. How do we make sure that that container orchestration component is actually secure? Anything that gets compromised that manages and helps with the deployment of a large distributed infrastructure could potentially be a high risk for you. So we look at the container orchestration aspect as well as the vulnerabilities and misconfigurations that could be in that orchestration component. And then the last bit would be the actual in-container configurations. So when you're deploying a container environment, you might be using a public repo, which would have a pre-configured image, which a lot of companies tend to use because it helps with speed of deployment. In this case, these images could be compromised from the get-go, and you're just using it based on word of mouth, trust based on other people or individuals that have used it before. Additionally, we'd also look at the container vulnerabilities and misconfigurations within that configuration. And then the last bit would be the container escape aspect. So some containers could actually have overarching access to things inside the network and outside the network, public facing and internal facing, which could be a risk for you in your environment. Some of the other things we're going to look at is from the attack surface perspective is understanding how the applications are developed, understanding a little bit about how the application network components work as well. In this slide, I actually drew a little brief diagram to show an example of two containers talking to each other within the same namespace. This would be something like what Dave was talking about, where you could have an application that's built with a front end and a back end database that reside in the same namespace. Potentially, they could also live in two different pods on two different namespaces. And there is a whole network communication flow that needs to be understood to allow for that access to happen. And that it itself could be a security risk that you would need to address. So we are going to cover a little bit more detail around how we would protect that. Some of the topics obviously are going to be using policies, creating isolation, leveraging encryption, the control plane security itself. So the kubelet and the etcd that Dave spoke about as well. We look at how we can secure those. The host itself, orchestration, and the containers. So when we look at using network policies to create isolation between different resources in your environments, whether that's pods, namespaces, etc., we need to understand where the traffic is coming from. So we have two different types of flows, ingress and egress access. So typically most customers will use the default out-the-box configurations, and this can lead to higher risk within your organization. So one of the things obviously we need to look at is any type of any policy that might exist. We need to make sure that these are all set as deny all for the interim. And as you slowly build out your applications, you allow specific permitted ports and applications to communicate between each other. We also need to make sure that no services allow incoming traffic directly from external IPs. As we know, there's a large list of malicious IPs out there on the internet, and a lot of those are doing random or full-on attacks against specific organizations, and you might be one of those. So obviously, it's best to make sure that you restrict access to trusted resources and IPs on the internet. Additionally, traffic and protocol communication needs to be also looked at, whether you're using HTTP, HTTPS, or DNS. In most cases, the likelihood of your applications needing anything but these three protocols is very unlikely. So best to make sure that you permit only those users or services that need access on HTTP, HTTPS, and DNS for ingress traffic. And additionally, services should never allow or accept traffic from anything other than the pods that they're working with. So an example from the previous picture, you might have multiple pods on different nodes. You will only allow communication between those pods that need to work with the others in that ecosystem. Anything more than that is obviously opening the door to huge risk. Now, the same can be said for egress access, So you need to understand where your services need to access. You might have developed a specific transactional system that needs access to an outside database to publish or upload specific IPs, names, domains, etc. In this case, you need to make sure that you've permitted only the specific services out of the internet. Again, also prohibit outbound traffic from pods that don't need it. So if you have services that you've created that don't necessarily pull updates from the internet or push anything outside of your closed ecosystem, best not to allow those access controls to be in place. And then the last bit was obviously no external dependencies. So if you need to download something from the internet, or if you're using a DNS proxy or DNS fencing tool that sits in the internet or otherwise, if it's not needed, don't use it, and make sure that you keep that closed. Next bit, obviously, and this is a core feature, is encryption. So Kubernetes themselves, i.e. the Kubernetes IO team for Google, they have obviously outlined in their best practices that encryption between different components should be considered. And one of the main factors or main protocols that they would use is IPsec. Again, when leveraging these types of tooling, whether it's encryption from an IPsec protocol perspective for tunneling or using a certificate, there is a certain level of overhead that needs to be factored into your deployment. So best to make sure that when you're implementing this, you have enough resources to make sure that the systems are running optimally without any downtime or latency. I won't go into too much detail, but again, most of the systems, when you are deploying a brand new Kubernetes cluster where you have the master and the worker nodes, they have default out-the-box certificates. Before you go into production, make sure that you assess what certificates are there. If you need to create your own private certificates, publish with your own certificate authority, and then make sure that you use that for communication between those systems. That gives you better trust between your components and less likely that someone outside will be able to do a man-in-the-middle attack and gain access to your systems through that type of mechanism. Kubernetes control plane security. Again, when you have a Kubernetes infrastructure, you are obviously managing a large distribution of containers. The Kubernetes control plane, obviously, as to what Dave was talking about, allows for scalability, whether it's horizontally or vertically. If someone were to be able to access that control plane, they could ultimately crash your whole infrastructure. They could redeploy systems. They could do a number of malicious activities by using that control plane access. So what we would suggest, obviously, here is looking at controls to all these components, whether that is a physical firewall that resides on the perimeter of your container infrastructure, whether that's a virtual firewall or some other type of WAS or WAF-based application that you can use for security between those components. Additionally, within Kubernetes itself, there are a number of vendors that supply policy-based controls, which you could leverage. This will definitely help you to secure your infrastructure from external threats. Internally, we have obviously things to consider like pod security policies, which allows for the inter-pod communication, which we've spoken about briefly. We also have to factor in security for the secrets. When you have secrets that are used and it's the defaults, and someone were to use some sort of third-party malicious tool to gain access to the systems, they could potentially decipher the actual secret keys that are on those systems and use that in a malicious way to gain access to the systems and cause further havoc on your environment. So things also like role-based access are typically not always considered in initial deployments. So by considering RBAC in your environment and restricting access to key individuals, administrators, security architects, etc., this will obviously help to improve your security posture overall. One of the things that Dave also spoke about, and we'll go into a little bit more detail, is the host security itself. So when you're obviously deploying your environment, you will have a base host operating system that you would be leveraging to deploy all your Docker infrastructure to. Now, in a lot of cases, you can use standardized Linux distributions or even Windows for that matter, if you chose to do so. But you need to make sure that that host operating system is actually secure. Now, in a lot of cases, we all know that a lot of companies have a very strict or very loose, depending on who you work with, patch management lifecycle. So these are things that we need to factor in when looking at the host operating systems. Now, again, for a lot of this, you might have a specific hardening standard or benchmark that you need to match against. These could be NIST, SAN, CIS, or otherwise in your particular region or theater. We need to factor in a couple of other things when looking at the attacks as well, is the common vulnerabilities for those specific operating systems. Now, some operating systems are more secure than others. Not everyone is perfect. So choose your operating system wisely. Something else to factor in is the access controls, whether you're using Docker commands, SSH, sudo, etc. You need to make sure that the files that have the SSH keys or the keys to those particular commands is secure. So strong best practices for hardening the OS is obviously have unique and strong passwords, generate a brand new SSH key every time you generate a new OS or container. Make sure that you update your software regularly, whether that's bi-monthly, biannually, or whatever the case might be in your environment, but make sure that you keep it up to date based on critical patches. If you can enable automatic updates, again, this is more down to environment and your policy specifically. Try and do that. This will obviously alleviate the need for you to do the updating yourself. But again, based on patch management, you need to do some UAT and that before you go into production. So best to check it with your organization. Disable booting from external devices. Again, if someone were to physically compromise your environment and gain access to the physical host, they could put in a USB key or sorts or some sort of malicious device connected to the machine, either a keyboard that could mock your keys and basically interpret what you're doing. You need to basically make sure that the external devices are disabled. Look at closing any hidden ports on your systems. So some applications use multiple ports. You might want to factor in what is allowed and what is not allowed based on your use case and just disable those altogether. Additionally, look at any logs that you might have on your system. You could have a malicious actor that actually generates local logs on the system so they can see what's happening based on keystroke. They could be looking at how the machine is updated. They might be using this to collect and capture a large volume of data so that they could do a covert attack at a later date. So best to check this and see what's available in your system. Make sure you do regular backups and also make sure you perform regular security audits to make sure the environment is secure. Whether you do that once a month, once a year, or twice a year, or any other way, doing regular pen testing is very important for you in your environment. In terms of orchestration, we did speak about Kubernetes as the main one that we, in this particular presentation, there are obviously a number of other orchestration tools, but the frame that we're talking about is pretty much the same for both. In most cases, you should be looking at using certain level of access control to permit or allow only specific individuals to access and maintain your infrastructure. Things to consider obviously would be SSO and MFA. If you can use both, even better. This obviously limits people from gaining access or impersonating someone as well, because they have to be part of your organization to access those specific resources. Limiting direct access to your Kubernetes nodes. Again, if a node does not need to have internet access or public access across your broader domain, make sure that you restrict that to a specific group of individuals or specific network subnet that you can control. Also look at image and repository control. Whenever you create a new image, as we spoke about earlier, you could be downloading from the internet. Those images might be already compromised because they were built by someone that is not within your organization. It could be a public repo and you're just trusting based purely on other organizations using them. Make sure that you double check that. Also look at repo control. If you're using specific repositories, make sure that you allow certain individuals to upload or download from those specific repos and validate those repos on a regular basis. There are tools that can be used for scanning the repositories and validating those images for you. Prisma Cloud is one of those, and we can leverage that in your case. Also, code validation. Another thing, when you are doing orchestration, you can obviously create customized images and deployment scheduling, as Dave Dukenfield spoke about earlier. We can also look at validating the code before it actually is deployed, and using things like Prisma Cloud Code Security or Bridge Crew, we do allow that ability to check before the code is actually published to make sure that it is secure and doesn't get compromised at some point in the near future. All right, localized container security. These are some good best practices to consider when looking at a container itself. We did briefly speak about the repos. So in this case, we have GitHub, which is a very commonly used repo. Everyone can upload there as long as they have an account. It's free. So if you wanted to help other organizations by creating your own custom code and images, you could potentially do that and they could download it. There's a side effect to that, that obviously anything that they download, they can modify and then republish again to their own custom branch, which in effect could maliciously infect other people indirectly without your knowledge. So be mindful of that. We also look at public Docker hubs. So again, when you create an image, you can upload it to Docker. They have a hub, and this is a general broad database of applications or container services that could be downloaded for you to use. You should always double check these before doing anything. Now, a lot of companies will use their own standards called image, so please make sure to check this. Again, all of these can be secured through other mechanisms and be checked and tested on-prem if you needed to do that, or on the wire as it's getting downloaded. But again, best to try and do some due diligence before using these services and make sure that everything is secure. Okay, so that's briefly the security aspects of the container environment and Kubernetes in a nutshell. Now what we'll do is we'll look at how do we leverage Prisma Cloud for certain aspects of the same type of approach. So we do have a lot of things that we need to understand. So obviously, there's a lot of traditional applications that have existed in the world, and a lot of those applications are now being converted into microservices, as Dave alluded to earlier as well. So we have obviously lift and shift, we have refactoring, and then obviously building a fully native application as well. So as of 2022, when we first did this report, we actually found that there was nearly 70% of organizations hosting more of their network infrastructure and workloads in the cloud, and that's obviously increasing year on year. So the things are changing drastically every day, and we obviously need to make sure that we are aligning with that as well. So some of the things with containers that we need to understand is obviously there is a larger attack surface. Because these are now publicly available and they could be on hosted on multiple clouds, whether private or public, we are now giving ourselves more visibility to our attackers and to our customers as well, in a sense. So we need to make sure that we can reduce that attack surface by leveraging certain types of things. Now, obviously, microservices can help to a certain degree by allowing certain things to be micro-processed, so we can have just a front end on one service. If that service gets broken down or something happens to it, we can spin up a new one with a little bit more secure image and patch if we need to do so. Again, it doesn't really give us too many issues in terms of scalability, but does give us some problems potentially with security. We need to also look at the visibility aspect as well. So with certain orchestration tools like OpenShift, EKS, Kubernetes, AKS, etc., there is problems with understanding how the resources are being managed and what is happening to those specific systems. So we need to try and increase the security from that perspective. Misconfigurations is another very large problem that we see in most cases. A lot of customers, as we spoke about previously, will download standardized images off the internet, will maybe just deploy it straight up to get the system up and running as quickly as possible, because we're all about fast pace these days, and forget about actually looking at the security configurations or system configurations for that matter on most of those systems. By leveraging certain technologies, we can address that and prevent that from actually becoming a problem. The other things, obviously, is unauthorized access, which we know already. If most developers were to build anything themselves, they would allow any for everything, because that's typically how they like to work, because anything that's security obviously hinders their approach to getting things out of the door quicker. And then we look at, obviously, the supply chain attacks. Now, when you're doing software development, we need to make sure that everything from the development phase to the pre-development phase to production is obviously secure. So there are a number of ways of addressing this. Palo Alto definitely is the way to go with that. So when we look at the list of vulnerabilities that exist currently in the world, we obviously have a large number of those. Now, the data that we have here, this is from MITRE. This is obviously a little bit old, but it's 1 year back, but it's still relevant today. So obviously we can see a lot of increase in open source projects, and this is one of the main factors for the high increase in vulnerabilities that are out there in the internet. The other bit being also a lot of companies, vendors like Palo Alto, Microsoft, and others are obviously paying people to identify bugs in their code. And this obviously increases the number of vulnerabilities that are detected out there, because there is a financial benefit for someone to identify those bugs. And then obviously focusing on application security. So there is a lot of companies now that obviously have seen that certain applications aren't built natively secure. And now they're trying to address that through penetration testing and looking at ways to improve their code. And through that, obviously, these numbers would escalate drastically over a short period of time. Now, things that we also need to look at from the perspective of this sea of vulnerabilities is that we have a number of CVs that are published and get increasing on a daily basis. Again, there's a lot of different vendors out there, IBM, X-Force, for example, Palo Alto Unit 42, Homeland Security, etc. They're doing regular scans against these systems to identify these type of vulnerabilities and breaches that are happening on a regular basis. We need to obviously understand managing complex environments. So in most cases, a lot of companies are consuming third-party applications, as we spoke about, that they don't own or they have never built. And this is just for speed of deployment. So we need to make sure that this is being addressed. And again, this increases the number of vulnerabilities that you'll see in your environment. Adopting of new technology. A lot of companies are trying to be trendsetters or living on the bleeding edge. And by doing so, obviously, they do open themselves up to a number of zero-day attacks, because things are so new. We need to identify how to protect those systems. Now, in some cases, even vendor security technologies might not be able to protect them because it's so new, no one's seen it. So we need to look at how do we address that in a proactive way. And then the last bit is obviously managing complex environments. You might be an organization that has multiple different needs, from internal transactional systems to customer-facing databases and transactional systems. You could be a sales organization that needs to obviously input data from your customers, partners, and elsewhere. And that whole ecosystem is quite large, and we need to make sure that it's secure. And there could be different ways that those are built and access granted for those specific individuals. So these are things that also then increase the number of vulnerabilities that we would see in a typical occasion. So in terms of what do we do when we see these? How do we prioritize these types of securities, and what do we do to make sure that things are better? So there's a lot of old tasks for security specialists that still need to be addressed in terms of patch management, pen testing, security lifecycle in terms of what products they use, whether they're using a specific vendor or multi-vendor approach. How do they address zero vulnerabilities? There are a lot of those these days. And do those vendors that we trust have the capabilities to protect us for those specific zero-day vulnerabilities? So what is the common thing that people use? How do they prioritize this? CVSS. That is the most common score that most individuals or organizations will use to prioritize specific severities in their organization. Now let's look at what Palo Alto does. So in this case here, this obviously is from the CVSS database. There's a brief description on a specific vulnerability for a FluentD Ruby package. This shows you some examples of their scoring. So they have CVS version 3 and CVS version 2. You can see the vector and you can see the base score. They've rated as a 9.8, which is extremely critical for most customers. Now, in your case, if the system is sitting inside the network, it's not public facing, it might not be a problem. If you have the correct compensating controls in place, it might not be a problem. But if you don't have those, this is a high risk and you need to address it through some mechanism, whether that's upgrading to the latest version of FluentD or changing it for a different type of variant that would be best suited for your specific purpose. So as we can see here, there's a little bit of details around an attack. It shows you actually through the CVSS database, if you go into a little bit more detail, it shows you how the attack is impacted, how the attack is actually done. So this can actually give you some level of idea of what you need to do and how to protect that particular asset in your environment. So you can see there, this attack complexity is fairly high. Attack vectors typically coming through the network. So again, we spoke about containers. Containers do have a level of network access and control that needs to be considered. If you're allowing full internet access ingress into a specific system, potentially your container that is using this specific application could be infected or be compromised. So best to try and secure that. You can see the exploitability score is very low, which means it's easy to exploit. Impact is 5.9, which is reasonable. And then obviously the base score is 7.5. That's the average score of the overall attack. Again, you might still need to factor in how do you protect your systems. Now, common methods for CVSS for obviously, again, is prioritizing based on high score. Try look at environments that aren't affected and not likely to be exploited. So things that we need to try and address is like, you might have a separate internet environment that you're not even aware of. You might have a deployment from a development team that they're busy doing their own sort of internal testing. That environment has been spun up on its own without network security or SecOps knowledge. And now that system is potentially compromised and allows a backdoor into your environment. So score itself is not enough. You need to understand the risk from those assets that exist in your infrastructure. So without visibility, you won't know what you need to protect. So here's a couple of common examples of most exploited vulnerabilities that are in the wild at the moment. These are all obviously 2021 and 2022. These might be fixed now, but some of them might still exist. Log4j being the most common one that we know of, that's been around for some time. That's still obviously very exploitable. It's remote code execution. We have the Atlassian Confluent Server and Data Center. So again, if your Atlassian server is publicly facing and people can access it using normal internet means, potentially they could get through the system using basic arbitrary code in the browser. We obviously have Apache and Spring Framework. These are, again, tools that could be compromised using basic mechanisms. Again, this information is actually drawn from CISA, so the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. Again, if you want to make sure that you are not going to be compromised against these, I would check the CISA database. They'll give you updated information based on that. But typically, it's a good resource to check and validate yourself. Okay. Another thing we need to consider is obviously risk-based prioritization. Now, risk in every organization is different and everyone's appetite is different too. So you might find that these type of exploits are not necessarily going to be of financial detriment to your organization, but it might be for someone else. And same thing for the applications that are being built. You need to identify where they're hosted, are they public facing, internally only, and then based on that, decide what the risk is for you and your appetite, and based on that, you need to be able to address those exploits accordingly. So in some cases, the CVSS data that we just saw might not be applicable because the systems are in an isolated air-gapped network and will never see the light of day ever. So in those cases, best not to worry about it. But if it's something that's actually public-facing, we need to address that with a little bit more urgency and care. If you look at risk-based prioritization, again, this is just sort of a triangle that gives you from high to low. What is the things that we need to consider? Obviously, we have exploited in the wild, critical CVSs, has remote code executable exposure for a container or the host itself. Obviously, there's low attack complexity or vector. Again, we need to take the overall number that we see from an attack perspective and see whether or not it is applicable to us. And then obviously the lower stuff, medium and low, is there a patch that exists from that specific vendor? If there is, let's take it, let's patch it, and we are now secure. And then we have less to worry about. Obviously, we still need to consider compensating controls and security protocols in place to make sure that system is more secure over a longer period of time. But this is something we need to address. In a lot of the cases, for the high and critical ones, you can still reach out to your vendor through support cases, and they can obviously look at addressing this. And this is where the bug bounties and all those other nice ventures that are happening help to secure our overall cyberspace. Okay. Last little bit is more of a CV prioritization with Prisma Cloud, and how do we look at that? So obviously we have in Prisma Cloud the Vulnerability Explorer within our CWPP product, which is our workload protection tool. This allows us to obviously scan specific systems and identify certain exploits based on the MITRE framework, CISA, and our own Unit42 data. We can then address and give a specific scoring and weight and allow you to identify which systems you need to protect and secure. So this helps obviously prioritize specific systems. Based on the CVSSs we saw earlier, or CVEs, you can see that Palo Alto Prisma Cloud was able to detect most of these. We gave them the CVE rating, we look at the severity, and we can take action against these. So in all cases, we can actually proactively protect your environment from any of these exploits as needed if you're running our Defender images. You can also see within Prisma Cloud, we do also outline some of the details in terms of the risk and how we identify this based on the different vendors that exist there. So obviously the CISA native database, we look at their information. You can click on that, it'll redirect you and it'll give you some more insight onto that specific service, or in this case, image, the DVWA image. You can actually see that this was downloaded from the internet from InfoSlack. It's the latest version and it was already vulnerable from day one. So through this, we can actually see where the exploit is coming from in the wild. This is relatively new. You can see that the container was running as root. So you can see the permissions. You can see most of the listening ports are open. There's nothing secure there. And you can see that the complexity to attack this machine is relatively low and it's happening through a DOS attack over the network. So again, great insights from the tool, which is everything you want to see when trying to protect your container infrastructure. If we go into more detail, again, we can outline each of these and see where the exploit is coming from through DOS, as we spoke about, the packages in use, meaning it's running in your environment, in production, or could be pre-prod. You can see there is a fix for it. So the fix can be addressed using a patch from a specific vendor. In this case, the could be a new image. You could also use a specific patch. This is for MySQL. You could also look at exploit for POC. This is relatively new. And you can see this, the exploit is done through remote execution. So this doesn't have to be physically present in your environment. It could be done over the internet. This is very helpful information again. If we go further in, obviously you can see how the container was running. We just spoke about this briefly. So sensitive information provided in the environment. There could be private keys that are available. These weren't secure in a secure store. They might be the default ones. The root is running all the time, which means that if someone were to compromise the system, they had full access to the file system, which means they could delete the image, they could steal data, or they could change and modify the image to their purposes. In this case, it could be used for, Bitcoin mining. It could be used for permanent remote access into your environment, etc. Again, in a brief high level, what you can also do within the product, we can also look at using just the little bullet points at the bottom there. If you hover over the specific severities, it will give you a little bit of more high level details around the specific POC vulnerability for the systems based on the filter that we've created for high risk or high severity thresholds, with CVE respect of exploit over proof of concept code. So this is very helpful information from Prisma Cloud. Again, we can do the same for images. So if you're looking at images that exist in your environment, this was the DVWA. This wasn't a specific service, this is our entire image. We can actually see when this image was released. We can see the hash for the image. We can see the image base OS that was used, the distribution. We can see the data was released and when it was deployed, and we can see who identified it, which was a Defender that was deployed from Palo Alto Networks. All right, then we have obviously some controls in place that can help within the product to also protect against those types of exploits. Now, obviously, when you're downloading from a public registry, it is always important to pre-scan and check everything before you deploy it. In this case, we obviously can use some level of basic alerting. If you want to only do that without blocking, this allows the product to identify the threats, and you can take response on your own accord with your SecOps team to scan images and see if you trust it or not. This again comes down to risk appetite. If you want to, we can also do blocking. So if it identifies a specific risk of a certain category, in this case the threshold is high, we can immediately block it. So it will not download, it will not deploy in your environment based on that severity. If you want to, you can customize this accordingly. All right, and this is one case study that we had, which was Spring Shell. This is a specific exploit customer identified. You can see it is a web flux application running JDK9. It was remotely executable code. You can see it impacts a couple of different distributions, WebMC, Core Web, WebWMC, and Beans. And these distributions all can be seen as really high impacting scores and cover most of the possible exploit techniques that are out there, whether it is exploit via POC, does have a fix, remote execution, severity is high, critical network access, attack complexity is low, so it's very easy for someone to gain access to your system, and exploit is available for anyone publicly on the internet. And that pretty much is me in a nutshell. I hope that that was informative. If you do have any questions, please do reach out to us and we'd be happy to answer any of those that you have. Thank you.
Great presentation, Dave and Gareth. I really enjoyed that. I know the audience did as well. That was a just information-packed session there. Thank you so much. We do have some questions coming in from the audience. We've got time for just a few questions, and I'll go ahead and start off with this first one. They're asking, how do you identify suspicious behavior or potential security threats in real time? Is that possible?
Yes, we can. Through Prisma Cloud, we have the ability using our Defender technology in the workload protection to see any attacks that are happening as they occur. So the defenders are constantly scanning.
Nice. That's really powerful. Let's see. Here's another good one. They're asking, how are you reducing the potential attack surface, and how do you limit the impact of a security breach for containerized apps?
So with the Prisma Cloud, we do leverage a number of features. We have infrastructure as code deployment through our code security module. This allows us to basically address the apps that are being deployed in real time from a coder perspective. So those that are being in-house built, we can actually scan through the IDE and make sure that the applications are secure before they get published. Based on policy, we can decide whether they get approved or not. They can go into a hold state until they address the specific vulnerabilities. Once they pass those checks, they can then be published. The same thing can be done for the repos. Through the workload protection and through the code security, we can attach ourselves to specific custom public repos or internal repos, and we can scan those images before they get deployed. Again, through policy, can either allow or deny based on the customer's specific unique needs.
Yeah, that's really powerful, preventing these sort of vulnerabilities before the containerized apps are deployed, before those vulnerabilities can cause some sort of breach. So here's another good one from the audience. They're asking, are the containers running the latest security patches and updates? How do you know that?
So through another module, CSPM, our Container Security Posture Management feature, our Cloud Security Posture Management feature, we're able to do real-time scanning and assess those machines on a regular basis. Based on that, we can see any of the configurations, whether they're misconfigured or correctly configured based on policies that we've addressed. So we have a couple of out-of-the-box policies which will easily identify most common use cases, and we can create custom ones based on the customer's specific requirements too.
Nice. And is there a way to prioritize risk?
Yes, we have dashboards within the product, and we have set algorithms from Unit 42 that we've created internally, which allow us to identify specific risks. Again, we use CVE data, MITRE framework, and our own, but we correlate the data together and we can identify the best risk for your environment at that time. Based on that data, you can decide how you want to address it.
Excellent. All right, well, I'm afraid we're running out of time here in this webinar session, but again, this has been really great. Gareth and Dave, what do you recommend, Gareth? How should folks get started with the Palo Alto Network solution?
Well, if they want to, they can reach out to our sales team and they'll be happy to give a POV, a proof of value, and show you exactly how the product works, whether you are on a dark site customer where you want to do fully on-prem with our workload protection module. If you want to, and you're a public cloud-facing customer, we can easily spin up a tenant for you and go through the whole lifecycle from code security, so using our code, build, deploy, run methodology, and getting you up to speed with Prisma Cloud.
Awesome. All right. Well, this is a great way to wrap up the event. Thank you so much again, David and Gareth. Great presentation. And of course, thank you to Palo Alto Networks for supporting us on the event. For more information, check out the handouts tab for some additional resources. And with that, it's now my pleasure to announce the winner of the Amazon $250 gift card prize on the live webinar. This is going out to Jim Chow from Mississippi. Congratulations. We'll reach out to you, and we'll also be reaching out to our best question prize winner. Again, visit Palo Alto Networks and check out the handouts tab for more information. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.